On the distant, forgotten world of Zephyrin I, the alien Lord Imgrath, ruler of the Catal, sat on his throne, his sharp eyes narrowing as he stared at his only daughter. Veldara, the princess of the Catal, stood before him, her shoulders slumped in a posture of resignation. The Catal were an ancient and powerful species, their empire vast, stretching across galaxies, their warriors unmatched in strength and intellect. But Veldara was none of these things. She had no aptitude for the arts of war, no natural talent in telepathy or combat, nor the commanding presence that defined the very essence of Cal leadership. Magrath had seen countless powerful leaders among his people, mighty generals, brilliant tacticians, and formidable rulers. His own name was whispered with reverence, for he had forged alliances and crushed enemies across the cosmos. But Veldara, his only child, was a cruel mockery of the Keltal legacy. She had failed every training exercise, every test of her abilities. She was, in the harshest terms, a disappointment. Her lack of ability was not just an embarrassment, it was a failure that threatened to tarnish the proud name of the Cal forever. His mind was clouded with frustration as he observed her. The silence in the grand hall was deafening, punctuated only by the soft hum of the crystal columns that lined the edges of the room. Veldara's silver-beautiful skin shimmered faintly under the soft lights, her black hair flowing around her like a dark cloud, yet there was no fire in her eyes. She looked like a ghost, a fragile thing barely clinging to life. Though she was fully grown, with the potential to become so much more. Yet, as her father had come to realize, she had no interest in power, no hunger for greatness. She only wished to fade into the background. He could not bear it any longer. He had tried everything to awaken something in her. He had sent her to the finest tutors, the most skilled warriors, but nothing had worked. She was nothing like him. Nothing like the mighty Catal warriors. There was no warrior spirit within her, no will to conquer, to claim her place in the galaxy. In his frustration, Lord Magrath looked down at Veldara, her head bowed. He had tried to love her as a father, but it was hard to love something that refused to live up to the expectations of the Catal. He had one choice left, one that went against his nature, but he saw no other option. "Veldara," he said coldly, his voice echoing through the chamber, "I've given you every opportunity. You have failed me and yourself. Your future with the Cal is meaningless." Veldara flinched at his words, but she didn't look up. The weight of his condemnation was not new to her. She had heard it 1,000 times, and each time it chipped away at her soul. "I will send you away," Magrath continued, his tone hardening. "I will offer you to the humans. They are a primitive species, but they are growing in influence. Perhaps, in their hands, you might find some worth. They are known for their strange resilience. Maybe they will teach you something." Veldara's heart skipped a beat, though she could not explain why. The humans were nothing to her. She had heard little of them, but they seemed like insignificant creatures to be discarded from the vastness of the cosmos. But in her silence, her eyes did not betray the storm of emotions inside her. What did it matter where she went? Her life had no purpose in her father's eyes. Perhaps the humans would be her only escape from a future that no longer had meaning. Lord Magrath's voice was final. "You will leave immediately. I will arrange for you to be taken by the human diplomat, Captain Nathaniel Callahan. He is a man of some repute. If you can be of use to him, then so be it." With a sharp, dismissive gesture, Magrath turned away, his mind already occupied with more important matters. His decision was made, and there was no turning back. Veldara would be the humans' problem now. But as she stood there, alone in the grand hall, the weight of her father's decision began to sink in. She was not just a failure to him. She was nothing. But maybe, just maybe, in a new world, she could find something worth living for. Captain Nathaniel Callahan had spent most of his career as a diplomat in the far reaches of the galaxy, negotiating with alien races, establishing trade routes, and fostering alliances. He had seen much, but nothing prepared him for the moment when he stepped aboard Lord McGrath's warship, the Dread Queen. The sheer size of the Keld vessel was awe-inspiring, its obsidian-colored hull glistening in the stars, exuding a quiet menace. The repressive energy of the hull glistening in the stars, exuding a quiet menace. But it wasn't the size of the ship that rattled him. It was the coldness in the air, the weight of expectations hanging in the vast emptiness of the ship's hulls. He had been summoned to meet with Lord McGrath, an alien lord of terrifying repute. The Cattell were notorious for their cruelty, their war-driven society, and their vast empire that spanned galaxies. To be invited aboard one of their ships was an honor few humans ever received. But what Lord McGrath had to offer was something far beyond what Nathaniel had expected. The meeting room was imposing, the walls lined with holographic displays of star systems and war strategies. But what caught Nathaniel's attention most was the figure standing beside the Kale Lord. Veldara, the Kale Princess. She stood with her head lowered, her posture stiff, as if bracing for some unseen blow. Her skin was a luminous silver blue, her long black hair spilling over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal. But there was something in her eyes, an emptiness that seemed to speak volumes. Lord McGrath's voice broke the silence. "Captain Callahan, I trust you are ready for the offer I have prepared." Nathaniel stiffened. He had no idea what to expect, but his training had prepared him for anything. "I'm listening, Lord McGrath." "Then, hear me well," McGrath began, his tone commanding. "I present to you my daughter, Princess Veldara. I have no use for her. She is lacking. She is weak in every regard, incapable of fulfilling her role as a leader of my people. But perhaps she will find her place among your kind." Nathaniel's mind reeled. His eyes shifted toward Veldara, who remained silent, her gaze never meeting his. A sharp pang of sympathy washed over him. The princess was clearly no ordinary alien diplomat. There was something fragile about her, a vulnerability that was not at all expected from a Kel ruler's offspring. Lord McGrath's words continued, cold and devoid of affection. "You will take her with you. She will be your responsibility from this moment on. If she proves useful to you, so be it. If not, she will fade into irrelevance." Nathaniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was a gift, yes, but it was more like a burden. An unwanted princess cast aside by her own father. It was clear that Veldara had no place in the Call's ruthless, war-driven society, and now her fate rested in the hands of a human captain. But there was something about her, something in her quiet sadness, that made Nathaniel feel an unexpected protective instinct stir within him. Lord McGrath stepped aside, a dismissive gesture that made it clear the matter was closed as far as he was concerned. Nathaniel had never encountered anything like this. A father disowning his own daughter, offering her like a prize to a stranger from another species. "Very well," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the strange emotions swirling within him. "I will take her. I will ensure she is safe." At the words, Veldara's eyes flickered briefly upward, meeting Nathaniel's for the first time. There was no gratitude in her gaze, no hope, just resignation. She nodded, though she said nothing. As the exchange concluded, Nathaniel felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders. He had accepted this task, this duty. But what had he truly taken on? A broken princess, abandoned by her own father. And yet, deep down, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that this could be the beginning of something far greater than he had anticipated. He would protect her, not just as a responsibility, but as a challenge to himself, and maybe, just maybe, in the far reaches of the galaxy, they both would find a new purpose together. Veldara had always known that she was different, not in the way her father had been so quick to point out, but in the way that made her feel completely isolated. The Kal, her people, were born to conquer, to dominate, to lead. She had been raised with the expectation that she would embody all the qualities of the greatest warriors and rulers of their empire. But instead, she had become a disappointment, a burden. It wasn't that she didn't try. It was that she had never felt any connection to the things that mattered most to her father. When Captain Nathaniel Callahan had taken her under his wing, she had expected more of the same. The humans were primitive, weak by Cal standards, and certainly no better than her own people when it came to understanding power. But when they boarded his ship, the Inferno, and she found herself alone with him, something strange happened. He wasn't like Lord McGrath. He didn't look at her with disdain or pity, but with something else, something that, for the first time in her life, made her feel like she was worth something. His eyes held no judgment, no expectation, just quiet curiosity. At first, she kept to herself. She had no desire to engage, to train, or even to understand what was happening. She didn't want to be a part of this world of humans. She wasn't sure how long she could stand being away from her home, away from the place that had defined her entire existence, despite all its emptiness. But as the days went on, she started to realize that there was something different about the humans aboard the Inferno. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Nate was patient with her. He never forced her to speak or to act, but he also didn't let her hide from herself. "You've got to stop thinking you're useless," he would tell her during their long sessions. "You've got to stop believing that just because you don't fit their mold, that means you don't matter." His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. It took her weeks to begin opening up to him, and even then it wasn't easy. She was an alien among humans, a princess cast adrift in a galaxy full of strange, unfamiliar faces. But Nate never treated her like a weapon to be forged, nor a piece of royalty to be paraded around. He treated her like a person, something she had never truly experienced. Training began slowly. At first, Veldara resisted every move, every attempt at combat. She hated the way her body felt awkward with the human weapons, how uncoordinated she was in their simple training simulations. But Nate never gave up on her. He would patiently walk her through each move step by step, even when she failed over and over again. "Try again," he would say, always calm, never harsh. "You've got power in you, Veldara. You just have to find it." It was a strange thing, but with each failure, something began to stir inside her. There was a spark in her that had been long buried, a fierce drive she hadn't known she was capable of. She began to notice the subtle power that hummed beneath her skin, the potential she had never realized. It wasn't the kind of power that came from being a Catal princess. It was something far more human, far more complicated. At night, as the stars drifted past the windows of the Inferno, Veldara would often find herself awake, staring at the vast emptiness of space, her mind racing. She had lived her entire life trying to meet the expectations of others, trying to fit into a role that had never truly been hers. But now, under the watchful eyes of Nate and the human crew, she was starting to realize that maybe she could forge her own path. Maybe her worth wasn't tied to her father's bloodline, to her K-Cal heritage, or to the crushing weight of her people's expectations. Maybe, just maybe, her worth was something she could define for herself. But it wasn't easy. The fear that had plagued her all her life, fear of failure, fear of never being enough, still lingered. Yet, in the quiet moments when Nate wasn't watching her, she could feel the power that had once seemed so alien to her. The fear didn't go away, but it became something she could work with, something she could control. And for the first time in her life, Veldara felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe she wasn't useless after all. The galaxy was about to change. Veldara could feel it in the air, an ominous shift, a dark tide sweeping across the stars. It had begun with whispers, fragmented reports of entire colonies disappearing, of entire fleets vanishing into nothingness. Rumors of an ancient and deadly race known as the Vyrax Dominion, an alien species thought to have been lost to history, were surfacing once more. Veldara had heard little about the Vyrax before, only snippets in the deep archives of the Cal. Their history was dark, filled with bloodshed and conquest, much like her own people's. But unlike the Kital, the Vyrax were not driven by ambition. They were driven by annihilation. Nathaniel had tried to keep the crew focused on their current missions, dealing with smaller threats, patrolling the galactic borders, but as the news grew more dire, he knew something had to be done. The Vyrax were not a force to be ignored. They were the true embodiment of terror, a race whose very presence demanded respect and fear, and their sudden resurgence could unravel everything humanity had fought to build. One day, the ship's alarm sounded. Veldara had been in the training bay, working on her hand-to-hand combat drills, when the call came. Nate's voice echoed over the intercom, tight with urgency. "All hands to battle stations. We've just received a distress signal from Urith Prime. The Vyrax are attacking. We need to move, and we need to move now." Veldara's heart raced. She had known the time would come, but it had always seemed so far off, like an inevitability that couldn't quite touch her. But now, as the ship's systems hummed with activity and the crew scrambled to prepare for battle, it felt real. This wasn't some faraway threat. This was the beginning of something far greater, and she was about to be thrust into the center of it. She made her way quickly to the command deck, her body instinctively moving as if it had always known the purpose she was now coming to realize. Nathaniel was already there, coordinating the fleet's movements. He looked up when she entered, his face set in grim determination. "Veldara," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're not just going to fight to protect Urith Prime. We're going to fight to hold the line. The Vyrax are relentless. They've already overrun half the system." Veldara nodded, her pulse quickening, her mind racing. She wasn't ready for this, not the way the humans were. They had faced adversity, had fought wars and struggled for their survival. She had been born into a life of privilege, of security, only to have it shattered by her father's dismissal. But she had learned from Nate and his crew, learned that a person's worth wasn't in the titles they held, but in what they chose to do when confronted with danger. "I'll fight with you," she said, her voice strong despite the doubts that still lingered within her. "I'll fight to protect these people." Nate's eyes softened slightly, but he didn't have time for reassurances. "I know you will. Get to the fighter bay. You're going to need to get in the thick of it." The fighter bay was a whirlwind of activity. Humans worked together with an efficiency that was both inspiring and intimidating. Veldara was given her own fighter, a sleek silver ship that hummed with power. It was nothing like the massive, heavily armored warships of her people, but it had its own kind of beauty, agile, quick, and deadly. As the fleet assembled, Veldara's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't ready for the chaos of battle, for the sounds of blaster fire, the explosions, the fear that would undoubtedly fill the void of space. But she had learned enough in her time with Nate to know that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to face it head-on. The moment they entered the fray, the full scope of the Vyrax threat became clear. The Vyrax ships were massive, their design alien and terrifying, with sharp, jagged edges that looked as if they were made for destruction. Their weapons fired with brutal efficiency, decimating everything in their path. The humans, though, were swift, agile, and relentless. They hit back with everything they had. Veldara's fingers tightened around the controls of her fighter, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the first Vyrax ship in her sights. Her training kicked in, all of Nate's lessons flowing through her like muscle memory. She could feel the power in her body, the energy she had always been told she lacked, now awakened and alive. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. She was not useless. Not anymore. She was a warrior, not by birthright, but by choice. And as the Vyrax ships loomed ahead, she was ready to fight. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a princess who had been discarded. She was a hero, fighting for something worth protecting. The battle raged on in the black void of space, a chaotic dance of light and destruction. Veldara's fighter darted through the waves of Vyrax ships, her hands steady on the controls, her focus sharper than it had ever been. The cockpit buzzed with energy, blaster fire flashing all around her as the Vyrax ships unleashed a barrage of deadly attacks. Their ships, large and ominous, seemed to absorb the darkness of space itself, their jagged shapes cutting through the stars with terrifying precision. Veldara had never felt the adrenaline rush of combat like this, not even in the training simulations she had undergone aboard the Inferno. This was real. The stakes were no longer theoretical. The lives of entire planets hung in the balance. As a Kel princess, she had been taught to view battles as an extension of power, cold, calculated, and brutal. But now, fighting alongside humans, she was beginning to understand something more profound. It wasn't about power for the sake of power. It was about protecting others. It was about standing against the darkness, even when it seemed impossible. "Veldara, watch your six!" Nate's voice came through her comms, cutting through the chaos with his usual calm. She didn't need to look over her shoulder to know what he meant. A Vyrax fighter was closing in on her, its weapons primed for a lethal shot. Without thinking, she yanked the controls hard to the right, sending her ship into a sharp roll, narrowly avoiding the blast that streaked past her. The Vyrax fighter pursued relentlessly, its engines howling as it aimed for another strike. She was still learning, still adapting to the rhythm of this battle. The humans, in their strange and human way, were teaching her more than just combat. They were teaching her how to be resourceful, how to think in the moment, how to trust her instincts. Her instincts. She had always thought they were something weak, something that couldn't be relied on. But now, as the Vyrax fighter locked onto her again, she realized they were her strength. In a split second, she pushed the throttle forward, engaging her fighter's boosters. The ship shot forward, just narrowly missing the next shot from the Vyrax, and she spun it hard to the left. The Vyrax fighter overshot, unable to adjust in time, and Veldara used the opportunity to lock onto its hull with her weapons system. Target locked, her HUD blinked in green. She exhaled slowly, her focus intense. "Firing!" she said, her voice tight with concentration, and released the trigger. The blast hit the Vyrax ship squarely in the engine compartment, sending it spiraling out of control into the blackness of space. A surge of exhilaration washed over her, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of a hard-earned victory. But there was no time to savor the moment. More Vyrax ships were closing in, and the battle was far from over. She glanced to the side and saw Nate's ship weave through a mass of enemy craft, his movements a masterful display of skill. Despite his calm demeanor, Veldara knew he was just as driven as she was, just as desperate to protect those who were at risk. "Keep pushing, Veldara!" Nate's voice snapped her back to the present. "This isn't over until we force them to retreat." Veldara nodded silently, pushing aside the brief surge of triumph. There was more work to do. The Vyrax might have lost a fighter, but they were relentless. They would not stop until they had destroyed everything in their path. As the battle stretched on, Veldara found herself sinking deeper into the rhythm of the fight. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking ahead, anticipating the movements of the Vyrax fighters, calculating the best angles to attack. She was no longer the princess who had been cast aside. She was a part of something bigger than herself, something that required her to stand and fight. The thought filled her with strength. She had once thought that her purpose was defined by her bloodline, her lineage as a Ketal princess. But now, she knew that her purpose was to protect those who could not protect themselves. She was here, in the thick of it, because she had chosen to be. Her comms crackled again, and this time it was the voice of the ship's commander. "We've got reinforcements coming, Veldara. Hold tight." A wave of relief washed over her, but she didn't let it distract her. She wasn't about to let her guard down now. She was no longer the fragile, useless princess her father had discarded. She was Veldara, a warrior. And the fight wasn't over yet. The Vyrax fleet was relentless, a cold and calculating force that seemed to be everywhere at once. Veldara's fingers gripped the controls of her fighter, her heart racing with each blast that flew past her. The battle had shifted. What had once been a series of isolated skirmishes was now a full-scale conflict, with the Vyrax pushing deeper into the system. The reinforcements, a small flotilla of human ships, had arrived just in time to stave off total defeat, but it was clear that the Vyrax weren't going to retreat easily. Their numbers were overwhelming, and their strategy was unyielding. The crew of the Inferno was holding their ground, but Veldara knew that if they didn't find a way to turn the tide soon, there would be no stopping the Vyrax from sweeping through the entire sector. Her pulse quickened as she watched her HUD, tracking incoming Vyrax ships converging on their position. The enemy was organized, their movements synchronized in a way that no human force could match. It was as if they were a single entity, each fighter instinctively knowing its place in the larger battle. She had never seen anything like this. The Katal were a proud and powerful species, but even their might had limits. The Vyrax, however, were something different entirely. Veldara had always been taught that her people were the apex predators of the galaxy, but now, with the Vyrax bearing down on them, she realized that they were just another cog in the endless wheel of galactic warfare. This was not a battle of pride, it was a fight for survival. Nate's voice came through the comms, calm but urgent. "Veldara, we've got to break their formation. If we don't, they'll pick us apart piece by piece." She didn't need him to explain further. She had seen the way the Vyrax ships moved, the way they coordinated their attacks like a living organism. If they couldn't disrupt that synchronization, they would fall one by one. "Understood," she responded, her voice steady despite the rising chaos around her. "I'm on it." With a deep breath, Veldara pushed her fighter forward, weaving in and out of enemy fire, her mind working quickly to calculate the best course of action. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking, planning, anticipating. Her instincts, honed through days of combat training with Nate, were sharp now, focused on the task at hand. The Vyrax had strength in numbers, but they lacked the adaptability that the humans, and now she, had. Veldara's eyes flicked to the corner of her HUD, where a blinking icon indicated a weak point in the Vyrax formation. It was a small opening, a gap between two larger enemy ships. If she could make her way through that gap, she might be able to disrupt their attack strategy long enough to give the humans a chance to strike back. "Veldara, what are you?" Nate's voice crackled over the comms, but she didn't wait for him to finish. She pushed the throttle forward, her fighter rocketing toward the gap. The Vyrax ships were closing in fast, but Veldara knew she had only one shot at this. She didn't hesitate, the cockpit filled with the deafening roar of her engines as she dove toward the opening. Her fighter barely cleared the first Vyrax ship, the tail of her ship grazing its hull. A blaster shot whizzed past her, narrowly missing. The air inside her cockpit felt thick with tension, her every nerve screaming at her to pull back, but she pressed on. With a skillful roll, she threaded her ship through the narrow gap, emerging on the other side of the formation. For a split second, the Vyrax were caught off guard, disoriented by her sudden maneuver. That was all the time Veldara needed. "Now!" she shouted into the comms, her heart pounding in her chest. Immediately, the human fighters closed in, targeting the disoriented Vyrax ships. Explosions lit up the dark expanse of space as their formation began to fracture. Veldara could see the shift in the battle. The Vyrax, usually so coordinated and methodical, were now scrambling to regroup, their focus fractured. The human fleet surged forward, taking advantage of the sudden chaos, and the tide of the battle began to turn. Veldara's breath was shallow as she watched the unfolding victory, but she didn't allow herself to relax. The Vyrax were still out there, and their determination would not falter easily. The moment of reprieve would be brief, and they needed to press forward while they had the upper hand. She wasn't done. Nate's voice came again, this time with a note of pride. "Nice move, Princess. You just bought us the time we needed. Let's finish this." A surge of determination coursed through her. For the first time in her life, Veldara truly felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. She was no longer the discarded princess of the Catal. She was a hero, one who had earned her place on the battlefield, and she wasn't about to stop now. The battle had shifted in their favor, but Veldara knew the Vyrax weren't the type to concede defeat easily. As the remnants of their fleet began to retreat, she could still feel the weight of the conflict pressing down on her. The humans had managed to break their formation, but the Vyrax were already regrouping, their ships retreating into the far reaches of the sector, only to return when the moment was right. It was time to act. This was far from over. Veldara's fighter glided through space, the hum of its engines a reminder of the battle that was still unfolding around her. She glanced at the cruise ships as they maneuvered with practiced precision, engaging what remained of the Vyrax forces. The human fleet was battered, but it was holding strong. The Vyrax might be a terrifying force, but the humans had something they didn't: resilience. Veldara had seen it time and time again throughout the battle. Where the Vyrax relied on overwhelming strength, the humans relied on wit, teamwork, and unrelenting determination. The thought struck her deeply. Her entire life, she had been told that strength was the only thing that mattered, that power was the key to everything. But here, surrounded by human warriors, she realized how wrong she had been. True power wasn't in brute force. It was in the willingness to fight for something greater than oneself, to sacrifice for the people and the future one wanted to protect. The Cal had always looked down upon the humans for their perceived weakness, their seeming lack of grandeur and empire. But Veldara was beginning to understand that greatness came in many forms. Her fighter's cockpit suddenly lit up with warning signals. The Vyrax weren't retreating after all. A large, heavily armored battleship emerged from the edges of the system, a vessel far larger and more dangerous than anything she had seen so far. This was no longer a skirmish. This was the Vyrax's final assault. Veldara's pulse quickened as she stared at the ship, the dark outline of the Vyrax flagship looming on her HUD. The ship was massive, bristling with weaponry, designed for one purpose: annihilation. She knew this was it. The final confrontation. If they couldn't stop this ship, everything they had fought for would be lost. The humans had come far, but now they would be tested beyond measure. Nate's voice crackled through her comms, steady despite the chaos. "Veldara, we need to take down that flagship. It's the heart of their fleet. If we don't, we won't have a chance." Her hands tightened on the controls, but her mind was clear. This was it. There were no more second chances. If they didn't stop the Vyrax now, there would be no galaxy left to protect. The humans had taught her to fight, to believe in something beyond herself, and now she was ready to face the greatest challenge of her life. "We'll take it down," Veldara said, her voice sharp and confident. The fear that had plagued her for so long was gone, replaced by the unshakable resolve that had been forged in the heat of battle. "I'll lead the charge." She pushed her fighter into the fray, weaving between the oncoming blasts from the Vyrax battleship, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. The Vyrax flagship was heavily shielded, but Veldara could see weak points where their defenses had been overextended. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only chance they had. The human fleet followed her lead, breaking apart into smaller groups to attack from multiple angles. They couldn't overwhelm the flagship's firepower directly, but with speed and precision, they could target its vulnerable points. The odds were stacked against them, but Veldara wasn't backing down. She had come this far, had fought through every obstacle, and now she would do whatever it took to win. The Vyrax flagship loomed larger in her sights. She could feel the tension building. every muscle in her body focused on the target ahead. "Hold steady," she muttered to herself, aligning her fighter's cannons with the weak point in the flagship's outer shell. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but her hands were steady. "Now!" she shouted into the comms. The barrage from the human fleet came in waves. Veldara's fighter launched a volley of precision shots, aimed directly at the breach in the flagship's armor. The first hit didn't break through, but the second shot landed with a deafening explosion, tearing a hole in the massive vessel's side. The ship shuddered, a groaning metal sound reverberating across the battlefield. The Vyrax flagship began to falter. It wasn't enough to destroy it yet, but it was enough to give the humans the opening they needed. Every ship, every pilot pushed forward with all they had, exploiting the breach Veldara had created. She saw the flagship's shields flicker as they began to give way, its destruction inevitable. With one final push, the flagship erupted in a ball of fire, sending shockwaves rippling through the battlefield. The Vyrax fleet faltered, their ships breaking formation as their command vessel was destroyed. Veldara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the remains of the massive battleship drift into the void. The battle was won. Veldara pulled her fighter into a wide loop, breathing a sigh of relief. Her body felt drained, every fiber of her being worn thin by the intensity of the conflict. But as she looked out into the void, at the remnants of the Vyrax fleet, she realized that this victory was not just hers, it was theirs. She was no longer the discarded princess of the Qatar. She was a hero, forged in the fire of battle and camaraderie, and in that moment, she knew she had finally found her true place in the galaxy.